combating transnational criminal organizations is not new. We use military force and have used it regularly, whether it was Jihad of South, the Southern Command, that typically taking advantage of the Coast Guard, the dual authorities of the Coast Guard, that is the only American agency that is both a warfighting organization but also a law enforcement agency. The Coast Guard have been the way in which most administrations, Republican and Democrat, have used military force when it needed to be used. Not only the Noriega, the Marines taking over Panama long enough to dislodge Noriega, but the Obama, the bin Laden-like operation that dislodged Maduro. I mean, this is in a continuum of events, but I've not seen anyone really analyze them. So the purpose of this session was to put issues on the table that we haven't explored together, meaning people from all over the political spectrum, in a long time. And it gave me the opportunity, among other things, to meet Ken Cuccinelli, who I had admired from a distance, and now have had the opportunity and will today to work with him. The idea of sharing ideas, and this session is intended to be very direct, somewhat informal, but it will address the two issues that I'd like to put on the table. Is one, I always thought that we should have a hybrid system. That is, we should have the military involved in the organized crime fight. And for me, the war on terror, compared to the war on drugs, in those crude terms, was the reason that I thought we should definitely use the terrorist designation, because in fact, to fight the war on drugs, because in fact, I was involved in that for 50 plus years, and I don't think it succeeded. And yet the war on terror, which I was involved in for 20 years, mostly has accomplished its aims in terms of both protection of domestically, but also the weakening of jihadist terrorist organizations, starting with Al-Qaeda and more recently with ISIS. So that's the question is, if we look at the foreign terrorist organization designation, how does that actually play in dealing with organized crime? And then the second part of this discussion would be, how do we actually apply this extraterritorially, all in terms of what's happened in Venezuela, and most importantly, what's going to happen or could happen in Mexico in terms of the situation there. So that's the point. The three panels today, which will be informed more or less by this discussion, I hope, are looking at the diplomatic and operational results of designating a TCO, a foreign terrorist organization. Then the second panel will be the legal authorities. What do the lawyers make of this in terms of international law, domestic law? What is the authority basis for the exercise of this power? And then the third panel, to be followed by a fireside chat, hopefully summing up the day, will focus on the geopolitical implications. What does this all have to do with oil, Russia, Iran, China, and the rest of Latin America? So let's start with the first question, which is, why will the foreign terrorist organization designation achieve what the administration and many of us hope it'll achieve, which is a weakening of organized crime, which particularly since the pandemic, but my impression is particularly in the last 15 years, has mushroomed in its international reach and in its power, that it has become a much larger phenomenon, not only in Mexico, but globally. For me, the reason that we won the war on terror was that we were able to deal with terrorist financing in ways that we had never dealt with it when it was in the domestic context. And I'd like to start there. I'd like to start there in terms of why were we able to squeeze financing from Al-Qaeda first, and then ISIS, and then together with kinetic activity really have an impact. Whereas with organized crime, notwithstanding law enforcement's constant focus on and claim that it's following the money, it very rarely does to end up with a result. So I think maybe, Ursula, shall we just take that, that microphone and give it to people? Although this is a great acoustical setting, so I think
yes,
schoolyard voices could actually also work.
Precisely. If somebody feels good projecting, that's great, but I'm happy to pass the microphone around.
Yeah, please. And yeah, Ken, why don't we just identify ourselves by name at least?
Sure. Ken Cuccinelli, graduate of the George Mason School of Law, most importantly, and the graduate school, which they keep changing the name of the degree, but at the time it was International Transactions. I also served in the Department of Homeland Security in the first Trump administration and was Virginia's Attorney General, which was the funnest job I ever had. But on this question, Alan, I don't think there's any question that getting after the money is very effective. It's one thing, you and I talked about this before, to get after jihadist cells. It's very important because they need the money to build meaningful execution to achieve their goals, which we don't want them to achieve. When we talk about the cartels, money is the goal. And so cutting off, reducing their ability to access, fill in the blank, you can put as many versions of that in there as you want, to get at the money eliminates their purpose for existence. And you know, we'll talk about this from a lot of different angles, which is one of the things I appreciate about today, but you know, this has a historical piece to it. Mexico has never controlled all of its own territory, literally since it was independent. And we're seeing probably the worst version of the competitors with the Mexican federal government in its history in the current drug cartels, with capabilities that are just almost beyond imagining. And so a law enforcement approach has proven utterly ineffective when we're going after what amount to de facto governments whose first priority is building up their intelligence and military networks. That's what we're getting after. So
just two follow-ups on that, Ken. First, can you describe, as a former chief prosecutor for Virginia, when we talk about the law enforcement approach that's not working, put that in context of, for example, with our domestic mafia, sure, and the success we had there, together with the problems that presents dealing with it extraterritorially.
So the history of the domestic mafia is a very good way to look at this. We're going back over 100 years for that fight. Of course, the RICO statute famously gave us tools on the enforcement side that had theretofore never existed, and were very effective. But let's not forget, we were going after people inside this country. So they were all within our jurisdiction. We couldn't, it wasn't just a kingpin designation of someone in Guadalajara who we then had to figure out how to get after. Every single person in the organization was within the United States jurisdiction. So law enforcement authorities give you coverage over everyone participating in that network. We do not have that in the current fight, and we have never had that in the current fight. That is an enormous, perhaps the single biggest difference. The second biggest difference from a prosecution standpoint is the what I'll call extreme limitations that the rules of evidence and how you plan to prepare a prosecution put on how you do everything up to that point, including law enforcement and so forth. When you compare that to the expertise that our special operators have developed in chasing money, not what you think of warfighters as doing, but they've figured out, as you said, Alan, it's such an effective part of their mission. They got very good at it, and that served America and continues to serve America very well. It seems to me we're long overdue for directing that kind of concerted effort and focus at these cartels who are killing far more Americans or facilitating the killing of far more Americans than any jihadist cells are doing.
Right. Thank you. So just the idea that the FBI used wiretap statutes, Title III capacity in this country to deal with a hierarchical organization, and the typical prosecutorial technique was used of getting lower level people to testify and turn on people higher in the chain, it worked dramatically well. And the forfeiture statutes permitted, to Ken's point, the taking of the money. So why doesn't that work in dealing with extraterritorial, with transnational criminal organizations nearly as well? And we're all thinking out loud, so don't hesitate. Now, Nathan?
So I think another factor that we need to consider...
How about, Nathan, your name and affiliate?
Oh, yes. Hi, I'm Nathan Goodman. I'm a senior fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center here at George Mason University. I think one thing we need to consider when it comes to combating drug cartels is that, especially for addicts, but also this has been observed more generally with drug markets, demand for these narcotics is inelastic in economic terms. What that means is when you raise the price, there's a relatively small response in terms of quantity demanded. And so the effect of interdiction efforts, for example, or of enforcement efforts is to shift the supply of drugs, right? To try to reduce the supply of drugs in a manner that will increase the price. But what's the effect of a price increase in a context where demand is inelastic? Well, because that price increase hasn't resulted in a very significant reduction in consumption, in quantity demanded, that means that the amount of profits obtained by the cartels go up, or by those who remain in the market, right? Because the price has risen, but the quantity demanded has not fallen accordingly. And as a result, you've increased the profitability of some of these enterprises. So because enforcement efforts have the potential to, for those who remain in the market, increase the incentive to remain, and they're going to weed out those who don't have specializations in criminality and violence, and they deter competitive entry in a manner that led Nobel laureate in economics Milton Friedman to say that from the economic point of view, when it comes to drug prohibition, the role of government is to protect the drug cartel, not that that's the role that you intend, but rather that that is a role that winds up being played. I think there are certain incentive effects that lead to it being very difficult to, by force alone, achieve the policy ends. And so I think that's a set of difficult constraints that needs to be taken into account. And I don't know how you take it into account effectively short of creating opportunities for legal alternatives in a manner that might increase elasticity.
So, thank you, Nathan. So two points there. One, and this is going to be important for the whole day, it is absolutely essential to recognize that we're focusing only on the supply side today. And Nathan's point is well taken. And my Mexican colleagues have always said to me, if you Americans would deal with this properly in a public health way, we wouldn't have half of the problems we have. But we're not dealing with public health today. But we should not forget that the demand side is a major part of this and a major failure in American society over a long period of time. But let me go back to your the point you made that on this idea of why money laundering, anti-money laundering hasn't accomplished in the organized crime context what it accomplished in the terrorist context. And you said government ends up protecting the cartels, notwithstanding all laws and policy pronouncements contrary. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the point here about protecting the cartels is that what winds up happening is you protect the cartel from competition, right? So if we think about the history of alcohol prohibition, for example, right, Al Capone and other organized criminal actors were a big player in that market, in part because ordinary people who might start a liquor store or a brewery, right, they were deterred from competitive entry. And the same is true whenever you criminalize a good, right? The people who are going to remain in that market are those with specialized skills in evading law enforcement. And the people who tend to specialize in being good at evading law enforcement and participating in illicit markets tend to be not the nicest people, right? So the effect is, it's not that you're protecting them as it's your goal to protect them, but you're prohibiting competitive entry by those who might offer substitutes from the standpoint of their consumers. And as a result, you're creating what economists would call monopoly rents, right? You're giving these cartels a monopoly that is protected by force. Obviously, they would use their own force to protect it, but in this case, the state also exercises force that protects that monopoly power.
So it's more of an indirect, and it's
correct.
Unlike the situation in Mexico, for example,
Yes.
arguably, where the government is actively
Yes.
protecting. This is not a Garcia Luna problem
Yeah.
that you're pointing to. Okay.
Yeah, so there's both the
Yeah.
corruption point you've referenced where there can be genuine corruption and rent seeking, but in this case, this is an unintended protection point that I'm making. So even with the best intentions, you get this.
I'm sorry, here we have Mr. Bauhaus and then Mr. Marquardt.
Okay, and then Mr. Veronica. Good.
Hi, thank you for lunch. I'm going to say who I am and where I come from because I think it's important context. I am Michael Beos. I work at the Department Against Transnational Organized Crime of the Organization of American States. We are a multilateral organization, intergovernmental organization. Included among our members are all the countries of the northern part of this Western Hemisphere, the Caribbean and Latin America. Responding to your question about why an anti-money laundering, anti-financial crimes approach has been not entirely successful. I'm going to leave out the corruption side of the issue because I think that's also an issue, but I think from our perspective, our focus is more on our member states and trying to help them build capacity to combat financial crimes and to follow the money. In our experience, we have come across, I guess, 3 big reasons why we have not been as successful in this effort. And the first is capacity. A lot of the countries that we work with are smaller countries, populations in the tens of millions as opposed to the hundreds of millions. And so just the demographics means that there is a limited pool of people who are going to be available to work on these issues at any given time. And the capacity also includes where they are now, what it would cost to get them to where they need to be. And so that's another issue. Most of these countries don't have much leeway in their budgets to be able to fund some of the more essential things that other countries have. And so investment in crime fighting, anti-money laundering is not getting the priority that it could because there's a competing environment for resources. We have always tried to make the point that an investment in combating financial crimes, anti-money laundering, is an investment that reaps returns. But this is a process that we are trying to convince member states to take on, and we try to show them that yes, there is asset forfeiture, etc. There are tools that can be used to help to offset some of the investment cost. The next part that we are seeing as challenges, the evolution, the constant evolution and the complexity keeps ratcheting. We're talking now about crypto and blockchain and fintech and all modern encrypted communications. All of these factors are difficult enough for a country like the United States with vast resources to contend with. But again, going back to that country with 10 million people or less, the capacity to respond and the training needs to be able to be up to speed is always a challenge. And so that's, again, another role that we feel we have. We can provide some help in that sense. And then something very, very practical and very, very quotidian. Turnover. We have a big problem with turnover. We train people 1 year, and then next year they have been promoted or moved into different sectors of the economy, and we have to train more people. And so our response to that has been, whenever possible, to set up training mechanisms within countries, providing them with the didactic materials and so on, so they can iterate on their own and not necessarily need us to go in time and time again. But this is all a part of a process that is being rolled out in real time. So from our perspective, those are the things that we are seeing as limitants to our effectiveness in combating anti-money laundering or financial crimes.
Hello, my name is Jim Marquardt. I'm from Johns Hopkins SAIS and Inter-American Defense College as well. And so I wanted to highlight what Ken Cuccinelli said in the beginning. When we're looking at following the money, is with a terrorist organization, money is the source for them to do their activities. And I think it's important to understand that money is the ends for organized crime. And so by cutting the money, a terrorist organization can't do anything, and you can trace that back. And they're not necessarily innovative in that sense in trying to get money to be able to do their operations. But when their whole objective and their aims is money, then they tend to be way more innovative because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for ways to make money. And so I remember going back to like 2010. When the drug cartels in Mexico, 60% of their revenue was coming from marijuana. And many at the time would say, hey, no, if we can cut that, we're going to, in theory, 60% of the revenue, most companies are going to go bankrupt, which is the case in most companies, unless you're an innovative company like Apple, for example, that does completely change their model. And this is what happened. If you look at the organizations now, the cartels, they're not drug cartels. They're not in the drug business. Apple is not in the computer business, right? They're in the tech business. They understood that, and they said, our goal is to provide technology, the latest technology. The goals of cartels in Mexico is to provide illicit goods, whatever they may be. So it could be drugs. We can eliminate drugs. Marijuana is now goes the opposite direction from the good marijuana goes from the United States to Mexico. So they understood that their market is the illicit market. And I'm going to take that one step further as well. Colombia, the cartels in Colombia now make more money out of illegal gold mining than they do from drug production. And the interesting thing with illegal mining, or illegal gold mining, is that is a perfect way to move money around because it's untraceable and it has a lot of value, especially with gold increasing. And so attacking the money is hard because attacking money, what money is their ends. And so I think, when we're labeling drug cartels or whatnot, we have to be clear of what it is we're trying to stop. And I think sometimes that's where we're missing is the definition of what our ends are when trying to combat these cartels.
John, and then, go ahead, okay. Fabio, and then.
Thank you. So, may I?
Please.
I'm Fabio Bechara. I'm state prosecutor in the state of São Paulo. 2 months ago, I'm working with Mike at the OAS, Department of Transnational Organized Crime. And I would like to add some comments in addition to my predecessors did. First one, I think the first question that we should answer is, what is the correct approach for all of these different phenomena? Historically, we used to approach it individually. And now we should approach them connected one to each other. The money is the same as a goal or as a tool. The money is on the table. The second comment, I think it's important when we are talking about a strategy from a transnational perspective, is that our countries cannot work isolatedly. And it's very, very hard to bring and join efforts from different countries. In the past, from a law enforcement perspective, we used to use MLATs as a very important way to deal with this phenomenon, but nowadays, it's not enough. Time decision right now is crucial to disrupt their capacity to engage. And you know that when we are taking an investigation case, it takes time. You have so many rules to comply with before you present the case to a court. And there is an ordinary way that we never know what's going on in the end. That's all that criminals want. We don't cooperate to each other. We put all of our efforts on a criminal case, on an investigation case, and the incentives for criminals are still there. So when we are talking about a strategy from a transnational perspective, my point of view, I think we have a lack of coordination within the countries, and it becomes worse when we are talking on a transnational perspective. I know that it's not easy because we have egos, interests, other soft skills that should be managed to put people together. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Ellen, and then Mr. Havranek. Yeah, there's.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I'm Omar Garcia Ponce. I'm an associate professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. And I study criminal and political violence in Latin America. With regards to the case of Mexico, I would like to highlight 4 things. The first one relates to what was mentioned before about local capacity. And I think like in the case of Mexico, we have not paid enough attention to building local capacity in terms of local police forces that today are completely co-opted by organized crime in many communities. But most importantly, I think we don't really have functional prosecutors. The fiscalías in Mexico are completely overwhelmed. Many of them are susceptible to corruption. Crimes are not investigated. And I think this is one of the main issues in terms of institutional capacity or state capacity at the local level in Mexico. If crimes are not investigated, if prosecutors leave just all these reports of crimes stored in a drawer, well, not much is going to improve if we don't improve the capacity of these local institutions. Then the second point relates to the recruitment of participants in criminal organizations in Mexico. Based on different studies, it's estimated that something around 200 and 250,000 people are involved in criminal organizations, are employed by criminal organizations. Many of them are young men, of course, with very poor opportunities of social mobility or economic mobility. And I think we have to invest more or to think more creatively on how to prevent these young kids getting recruited by these criminal organizations. And there are some examples of relative success in other parts of Latin America with interventions in schools and neighborhoods to prevent the recruitment of participants of criminal organizations at a very young age, which is, I think, the critical point. The third point that I would like to mention is the role of arms trafficking or guns trafficking from the US into Mexico. We know that at least 2/3 of the assault weapons that are seized by the Mexican state securities, when they are traced, the origin of purchase was in the United States. And it seems very difficult to move policy in here regarding getting a stricter gun control, but most of the weapons used by criminal organizations are coming from the US. And we have also to think of a way of trying to reduce or to curb the trafficking of guns into Mexico. Because some of these weapons, of course, are enough to overpower many of the security forces in Mexico. And the fourth point is that Mexican drug cartels have diversified so much over the past 10 to 15 years. Like now it's not only about drugs. Some years ago it used to be like marijuana or cocaine, then heroin, fentanyl. But today they are involved in oil and gas theft, in mining. It's very hard to know what percentage of the profits comes specifically from fentanyl trafficking into the US, but I have the impression that even if we could completely evaporate or significantly reduce the size of fentanyl demand in the United States, there are many other illegal activities, enterprises that are in hands of the organized crime in Mexico today that we also need to map, to understand better and try to tackle those issues.
Thank you, Professor Garcia.
Hi, thank you. Diana Paz Garcia, I'm an analyst at the Brookings Institution. I just wanted to build exactly on Omar's last point, that I think we're beyond thinking about the story of transnational criminal groups as only one of drugs and arms. Mexican cartels not only control all sorts of illegal economies, but also legal economies. And I think it is a lack of focusing on how they have become polycrime entities that has led us to a misunderstanding and misdiagnosis, and therefore bad application of policies. So I think, for instance, I don't agree with the designation, the FTO, but something that has given us the chance is that OFAC, Treasury, and FIU in Mexico have been much more proactive at tackling this part. So in the last 9 months, we have seen indictments for not only oil trafficking, but also casinos being operated by cartels, as well as illegal fisheries, and all sorts of legal economies that have been taken over. So I think by breaking not only the control of illegal and legal economies, but also the political nexus, we'll have much more effective parts. And that is part also, I think, in construction, the security cooperation. We were coming from the lowest point in security cooperation between the US and Mexico, and even if today we find ourselves at the highest point since the Merida Initiative, even if it is under constraint, I think we're seeing a collaboration that's extremely effective between FIU and Treasury, and I think that will help us target the financial part. The other element and the part of this equation is, I think, going after Chinese money laundering entities. Chinese criminal networks have become the to-go banks for criminals not only in Mexico, but also all around the world. And this is not only focusing on the money laundering part, but the wildlife trafficking parts. And this has become a market that is effective, especially for the Sinaloa Cartel and the Nueva Generación, in order to be able to exchange wildlife products for fentanyl precursors. So I think focusing on that. And also, finally, I cannot talk about drug cartels without saying that abandoning high-value targeting and moving into middle-layer targeting would be, I think, one way to push us forward into more productive solutions.
So I'll want to return to a number of what you're all saying, but let's get everything out on the table.
Ellen, I'm Ellen Lapson. I direct the Masters in International Security here. And while the center of gravity is clearly on transnational crime and cartels, I wanted to not neglect completely the structure that we started out with is terrorism versus transnational crime. And I think we've already clarified that You know, for cartels, money is the objective. That's the end game. They are profit motivated, whereas terrorists need money to conduct their operations at scale. But the truth is, money isn't the sum total of what terrorist organizations makes them work. They are more ideologically driven, and they can actually conduct, they or even in very small groups or individuals, can conduct terrorist activities successfully with almost no resources. So I think we do want to just make sure that that distinction about is money the motive is clear, and I appreciated your comment that what tools of the US government do you use? Is going after financing sufficient, or is it just a piece of the puzzle in the case of terrorism? And lastly, I hope that later in the day there'll be some more debate on whether designating cartels as FTOs, as foreign terrorist organizations, is productive. I would worry that if we use the FTO designation too loosely, that will create plenty of room for misuse, misunderstanding, abuse of those authorities for things that are in not just a gray area, but literally the difference between black and white. We have to be able to analytically make distinctions between these kinds of activities, and the FTO designation, to me, has some downsides. I hope later in the day people will weigh the pros and cons of moving in that direction. Thank you.
Specifically on counter-drug operations while I was on active duty. I then went to DHS and provided legal advice from the Coast Guard perspective, so on both sides of that coin. And I will tell you, and my point is because I spent my entire adult career looking at legal authorities, how to unlock those authorities to solve problems like this. That's how I always look at these questions. So for me, in this situation, what do you get by being designated as an FTO? And then your point of why did or didn't it work before. So to the first, the only thing you get from an FTO designation, you also have to look and see when you do that, what springs from that statutory authority. And that is the person is inadmissible to the United States. So arguably, I would say all these cartel members are already inadmissible to the United States. And then two, it now makes them eligible to be prosecuted for material support to terrorism. And then the third makes them eligible for more sanctions type of operations. Now, did it or didn't it work before? The way that we broke down counter-drug operations in the federal government is the responsibility for detection and monitoring lies with the Department of Defense. The actual interdiction lies with the Coast Guard and with Homeland Security. If you talk to DOD of where they want to put their resources, and the pot of money that they receive from Congress is larger than any other department in the federal government, is that they're there to win and fight our wars. And although they know that counter-drugs is important, it's not their focus. So DHS and other entities like DOJ have constantly gone to DOD and said, we need more resources. But DOD didn't want to focus that. And there was no one, whether it was at the White House or anywhere, that was telling DOD to provide those resources. That's the same not just in drugs, but in other things like mass migration in the Caribbean, where DOD said, not our job, we know we have a role, but not our job, DHS, you do it. So the difference we have now is we're using DOD in a different manner. We've surged all sorts of ships that are down there and have more resources, but within the first 3 weeks of this administration, DOJ got rid of the entire apparatus to prosecute them. And the Attorney General signed a memo that got rid of the unit that prosecutes drug crimes. So it no longer exists at Main Justice to even do those type of prosecutions. And the memo said the U.S. attorneys aren't to expend their resources in doing counter-drug operations. And I believe that has not changed since that memo was issued. So now we're using DOD in a different function and using them under armed conflict situations, which is not necessarily, well, it's not how DOD was designed to address this, which is raising a lot of other issues where we are. So I think the answer to your questions is resources. We now have the resources, but we're not using the legal authorities that Congress gave them to actually adequately address the problem.
So let me
this is fascinating. Let me challenge, I think, a couple of things, starting with John, who was my lawyer at DHS, so I can start with him, and he'll remember this. So if it's just resources and not will, why? Well, okay, but the fact of the matter is, so we have all the comments. We agree that it's about the money on organized crime, on TCOs. Oil is as important now, which Guadalupe identified with Azetas in her book a while ago now, just as gold mining is. And I understand all the problems of coordination, Fabio. I lived through them. Michael, I understand getting people to cooperate is a problem. I understand that crypto is complicated. But here's the question that I want to put on the table. If money is the objective, and put aside lack of incapacity in Latin American countries, why hasn't it succeeded in the United States? Why? And the problem has been the Treasury. You know, it's all well and good to say, well, we should really have Treasury doing a much better job in dealing with money laundering. But having knocked my head against that for almost 20 years, I can tell you it's not just an accident. That, in fact, we don't use money laundering the way we could to dismantle these groups, to actually look at them systematically. The question I want to press on you is why? Why?
John lays out very clearly a long-term kind of complaint back and forth between DOD, DOW, and DHS about getting after this particular problem. But the Department of the Treasury culturally opposes participation in this entire undertaking. They absolutely oppose it. They do not want to do it. Yes, they participate to a certain degree, but it is dragging their feet, kicking and screaming. And that is an institutional American problem that is continually slowing us down from getting at what we seem to agree is a central focus here, and that's money and cartels. I would make just two other points. One is that I believe it should be a strategic goal of the United States of America to get the Mexican government 100% control of Mexico. That, and I'm phrasing it in that sort of assistive fashion, because it starts to get at some of the other issues, the 250,000 people who are actively participating in cartel activities. The FTO statute was designed to get after Islamic cells that were trying to stay hidden, not quasi-governments that were integrating themselves into the society all around them. The dragnet of what you catch is so enormous that you start to lose some of the utility. I will say one other benefit of the FTO designation is the material assistance piece between governments. But what it does not get you, and probably a lot of people in the room, and just as a lot of people in Congress don't know this, it does not get you legal authority to strike cartels. People think FTO equals kinetic authority. It is not. We have been mistrained on that in the last 25 years because all of the strikes we've seen, all of the war fighting against terrorists has been done under the AUMFs in the 2001-2003 area. They all trace back to those declarations of war. That's the authority. That's the legal authority for the strikes. So to the extent that kinetic activity is going to take place, it's going to be one-off type of presidential decision every time. And that has its own challenges that come along.
Okay, let me, I want to come back to that, particularly when we move at the end of in the last part of our discussion on Mexico and kinetic use. But let's focus on the money. You said something, put together, the cultural resistance or the bureaucratic institutional resistance of the Treasury Department to actually employ money laundering statutes. Put that together with Omar's observation that you picked up on. We have 250,000 people involved in Mexican organized TCOs. Put that together with the idea that money is really, and it's not necessarily narcotics now, it's everything. So let me suggest to you that one of the reasons the Treasury doesn't want to do it, the same way, and I want to come back to what you educated me on the healthcare organizations. What Treasury doesn't want to do is actually threaten existing banking institutions in this country. And it's not just because they're partial to the banks. It's because they recognize something about contemporary organized crime network. They recognize something that we actually have to take into account to understand why we have all these problems. It's precisely because organized crime or network TCOs are involved in a whole range of activities that, in fact, they're embedded in the ordinary operation of the economy in ways that were never the case. And that's, I think, what we might look at as a reason why there's a hesitation to act in ways that really contrasted with the FTO, where you have choke points.
I would just very quickly disagree with you because I think the description from several folks here about their integration into what I'll call the legal economy, illicit economy, not illicit, the sophistication of that is fairly recent. They've always had to launder money. They've always had to run money into the legal economy. But the level of institutional connection you're describing, you know, I wouldn't say it was there in the 80s and 90s, and the Treasury Department had the same reluctance in the 80s and 90s.
Fair enough. That's the amount of money in the Federal Reserve System that could be traced to illicit means. But I think that's right. But I want to press a little bit more on why today, if they're so embedded in the economy, what does that mean, and why does it make it so difficult, even more difficult than the experience we had?
Well, I think part of it is that when you're dealing with the banking industry is so regulated and so integrated that when they take those actions, the collateral impacts of taking down banks and certain things, even if they're in Mexico or other countries. And I can't remember whether it was at the end of the Biden administration, beginning of this, but they designated 3 banks in Mexico, and that those banks essentially became completely inoperable. And if you look at the Treasury's website for that with OFAC, they talk about, you know, we've shut these down, but please don't take actions that that you don't know about. And I know that from my private practice, outside of the government, there's a number of individuals that now, because they had accounts or other things at those banks, can't even get an account within the United States to pay off credit cards or things like that. So the actual collateral implications that stem from those, that because of the regulation of the banking industry, is no one wants to be seen as lending, you know, providing credit, working with, or anything of anyone associated with anyone that's on one of those lists has a real collateral impact.
Absolutely the case. So why isn't it used more effectively and more extensively to actually have that impact?
Well, I think it's because of when I say collateral damage, I'm talking about unintended damage instead of the purposeful. And until you can figure out how to control some of the unintended, they're going to be much more reluctant, as Ken said, to do the purposeful. That's my point.
Yeah. Ambassador.
Alan, thank you very much. I'm Enrique Berruga. I'm the chairman of Mexico's Aspen Institute, and had different reincarnations in my past. I want to make a couple of comments. I think that your take on focusing first on money laundering is crucial. The problem that I see here in this discussion is that the size has grown so great that it's very difficult for anybody on their own to deal with it. We just learned through the apprehension of El Mencho in Mexico that the Jalisco cartel was operating in 60 countries. Probably in many of those 60 countries, they don't even do business the way they do it in Mexico or in the United States, but they do money, they launder money over there. I'm talking about perhaps Switzerland, Luxembourg, some of the Caribbean islands, you name it. In Africa, several banks, in Nigeria, and so on and so forth. So the size matters, I think. We need a collective strategy on this, otherwise it's going to fail. And as you said rightly, that the will is very important. If the Treasury Department, for whatever reason, is reluctant to go into it, that I don't understand really why, must be a cultural thing or something, because as you said, John, just a minute ago, they shut down 3 banks in one day in Mexico because they were connected to criminal activity. So if that had trickled down or actually had an ongoing effect, probably we would be in a different situation right now in Mexico because banks would be very fearful to deal with anything like this. Although this FTO designation, is like a bag for everyone, you know, because they say if you have any connection with criminal activity, for instance, maybe you sold a car in your outlet or whatever, and you don't know who you're giving it to, right? Or you are furnishing with stationery to a company, and they have connections with, so it's too lax. And one more thing, the capitating is perhaps the name of the word right now. It's very fashionable. But in the case of drug gangs, I think it doesn't work. We just have sent, 90 people from criminal gangs in Mexico to the US. So they basically are decapitated, and still they keep on working. So thank you very much.
So the kingpin strategy, we agree, doesn't work in the organized crime context. But I want to finish, devote enough time, a half hour to Mexico. So let me, though, just throw a couple of things out. Yes, the involvement, the embedding of organized crime because of the breadth of their activities is now much greater than it has ever been. And it reinforces the traditional hesitation that the U.S. Treasury had to enforcing it. But I want to make one point, and Jim, who's just gotten back from Colombia, will want to respond, but I do want to go on to Mexico. So, in my experience thinking about this, the only successful international law enforcement operation, but law enforcement was the way to do it, was the Plan Colombia. It accomplished virtually everything it set out to do. It put the FARC in a different place in Colombian history. It cut down on the violence in Colombia. It did everything but affect the flow of drugs, which is the demand issue. So it did everything but that. But let me tell you what, when nobody in the Obama administration would want to talk about that Plan Colombia, and it took me a while to figure out why. And the reason was the DEA, which had been working with the National Police in Colombia and had been providing intelligence, the key to dismantling, not just capitating organized crime, was that it dealt with the whole enabling community that existed. The money launderers, the lawyers, the accountants, the material assistants that you're talking about, that actually was the way in which this organized crime operated, but it was done Ben, do you have a comment?
Yeah, Alan,
And then
if
we'll
I-
go on to Mexico for the time.
If I can just quickly say thank you. I'm Ben Rorba. I'm a senior fellow at the Strauss Center at the University of Texas, and I work at a company called Lantern, UAS. And I think there's an important lesson from the way that American organized crime was disrupted, because I think there's rightly a focus on the commission trials, which were very successful. But I think before the commission trials of the 80s, we had already removed the pillars that underpinned their ability to move, to interact with the illicit economy. And for the five-family structure, those pillars were the Vegas system, and then were the Teamsters Pension Fund. I mean, those two entities that were incredibly important in their ability to take ill-gotten gains and then recycle them in legal ways. And both of those had been attacked throughout the 70s, right? There had been major changes to the way that pension funds were run in unions, and there were big changes and attempts to try and clean up money laundering in Vegas and some of the really more egregious things that were happening. And both of those, before the prosecution started, had weakened these organizations significantly. And so if you read things like Joe Pistone's memoir, right, Donnie Brasco in the 70s, all the wise guys in it are constantly complaining about money and talking about how things aren't like they were, right? They weren't able to run the same kind of things that they'd done in the past. They weren't getting the same kind of returns from their union activities and other things. And I think it's important to note that we'd attacked these two pillars of their system before the prosecution started. And we'd taken runs at prosecuting these groups in the past, right? It was done under Robert Kennedy when he was the Attorney General, and it was done under Thomas Dewey in the 30s, and both of those attempts were unsuccessful. And so it wasn't until we removed the parts of the system that let them recycle money into it that we were actually able to weaken them enough where people started turning on each other, and then the prosecution. I mean, and yes, there were important prosecution tools and other things that were in place, and RICO hadn't been used in the same way, but I think they were already at bay when we were able to do that, and I think they're important lessons that often get forgotten from U.S. organized crime in this.
Okay. There's a lesson there. So we leave the question on the table. Let me turn to Mexico for the time we have left. And Enrique Berugo, who was Mexico's ambassador to the United Nations, said to me a while ago, he said, for so many years, for decades, I thought the United States had a big problem with its neck. It could only look to the right and to the left. It could never look at what was in front of it in Latin America, its neighbors. Now we have an administration that has, in its national defense strategy, has put a focus, even an exclusive focus on, for purposes of that strategy, on the Western Hemisphere. Some of my friends in Latin America are not so delighted with that, but it does recognize something that Ken was alluding to and that I believe, which is Mexico is our most important national security partner. Absent a secure situation in Mexico, if in fact, and we saw that during the Mexican Revolution, the 10 or 11 years when there was significant chaos in Mexico. But some people say that a lot of this FTO designation is actually directed at Mexico. It's intended to provide a warning to Mexico that actions will be taken to deal with all the problems Professor Garcia indicated, which no prosecution, widespread involvement in organized crime, all of those issues and more, the ineffective police. But what is the actual kinetic, and people think about the FTO designation in drone and kinetic terms, but what are the other possibilities that arise there? And I will say, and people can debate it, but having watched Mexico for decades, I think the problem of organized criminal penetration into the political system is at a level that it has never been, and that unlike the situation with the PRI, the organized crime heads and their networks are actually now pulling the strings in many jurisdictions, not all, of Mexico. And the question is, as Lenin said at the Finland station, what is to be done? So, Ken?
First of all, it may surprise some of you to know that I don't support the FTO designation, largely because of it is far too overbroad. I would like to see Congress, okay, that's a bad start of a sentence, right? I would like to see Congress write a statute that is better tailored to the Western Hemisphere as opposed to the Islamic threat, Islamic terrorist threat, that is more suited to what we're all talking about. We shouldn't just accept that the FTO is the only thing that could ever exist. They took a model built for something else, and we had this discussion in the first Trump administration, and there wasn't a designation. You mentioned Mexico's response. There can be no question that part of the decision-making process, well, let me put it this way. It is very clear that Mexico didn't want anyone within the boundaries of Mexico to be designated a terrorist organization, because that suggests from the outside of Mexico that they are failing. That is a judgment of performance within Mexico. And it is very reasonable to view it that way. That's completely aside, that's a diplomatic aspect of the FTO designation, not a legal aspect of it. But, Mexico is one of the largest, most robust countries in the world, and with a very dynamic population and economy, separate and apart from the cartels, though not so much in the areas where the cartels dominate. And that is a real factor. Back to Mike's point about all of these local and state level capabilities you need in place if you're going to kind of wipe out something like this and then have something behind it that is real infrastructure. That is a major problem in the parts of the Mexico that the cartels cover. And I will say, it's not so much legal on your kinetic point. FTO doesn't so much provide legal authority. I believe it provides no legal authority for kinetic strikes, but it does provide political cover. And the President in the United States under Article 2 has a great deal of independent authority to operate, including the use of kinetic force. And we're seeing the debate following Venezuela. We're seeing the debate about Iran in Congress. Both sides of the aisle, which I always appreciate seeing, have differing views on the extent of this authority. And the FTO designation doesn't change the extent of that authority, but it will change the perception of it within the domestic environment where the decisions are made about whether or not to take a step toward kinetic application of force at some point.
Thank you. So do we have till 12:30 or? Okay, all right. Well, we'll have to come back to deal with Mexico off the record again.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
allowing
Ken.
me to take the floor again. In the discussion about organized crime and terrorism, I think that I want to reference Haiti. We've been starting to become very active in Haiti, and in my department in particular, looking at anti-money laundering. For us, the definition of two of the transnational organized criminal gangs operating in Haiti as terrorism organizations for us, from a very practical perspective, it unlocks a series of tools that can be applied to combating these gangs that we would not have otherwise. So from that perspective, obviously, we don't get to make the calls, but the calls have been made. And so we are now in a situation where how do we take advantage of the fact that we now have tools available to us that we didn't have previously? I think that's how we view it. Now, I think an interesting question might be, is it possible to simply apply the tools that were used against terrorism legally to the transnational organized crime? So bring the tools across and use those tools and that capability to focus on what we feel is a more clear and present threat in this hemisphere to all the countries, which is transnational organized crime. Just a suggestion.
So let me ask, we can ask the question, Michael, then, notwithstanding, and the material assistance is a important tool that can be used in the law enforcement and in the FTO context. But let me ask you, and this is not, Enrique, about hotels, gangsters staying in hotels. Let me ask you what you think would have been the difference if HSBC, which was caught up in money laundering at a massive scale and was fined hundreds of millions of dollars, what do you think the impact would be, taking into account John's point that we don't know what the collateral effects are, and that's what scares Treasury? What do you think the difference would have been if HSBC had been prosecuted and shuttered for having been material assistance to what do you think the impact would have been, to Ben's point on removing basic pillars of financing? What do you think the difference would have been? But we don't know because it wasn't done, and we still don't know whether it should be done because we don't really understand what the fallout would be. Anyway, Enrique, do you want to?
No, that's a very good question. I think that we don't know about the fallout, as you said, that would have implied something like that. But the message would have been clear-cut to these guys. More so, and I sympathize with all those that have their doubts about calling them FTOs now, whether it's a good designation or not. Because to my knowledge, Mexican cartels have even noticed that they are now an FTO. They have not changed their behavior a bit since then. But in this case, I mean, if money is the buzzword for all this business, illegal business, actually tracking the money is the most important thing. And getting to big fishes like the one that you just mentioned could be a very important signal to the financial system. Because, mind you, there's also corruption in the financial system. I mean, it's very difficult to, I mean, it's not a clean-cut thing that you go there and you just get a mortgage or something. No. There's a lot more, and lots of money is dirty in their hands. So we have to be mindful of that who are we dealing with? So sending a message to the financial system could be a very important issue, I think, Alan.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you all. This, from my perspective, this served the purpose. We talked openly and broadly about a big problem, and I think, Ursula, what's the next step for the group? And I will say, Wyeth, when we get into the formal sessions, you will control the timing. This was a more open-ended discussion, so thank you.
So we will take a short transition break, and we'll meet back here at 12:30. So in the same room, yes.